Hello, and thank you for joining us. This is No Soundbites Allowed, and I am your host, Michael Voss, Dragon of the Southern Tier. I'm happy to be here with you today as we talk about a very important subject. In fact, some of you may have heard about this approximately 24 hours ago. The United States Attorney General Merrick Garland spoke in front of the Senate hearing to talk about, in part, the October 4th memo he issued, which instructed the federal government to become involved in local school board meetings, local communities, to go into the school boards and to potentially investigate parents for speaking their mind. That's essentially it. And it's a very big issue. And he spoke at this for about 4 hours yesterday. Many people didn't see the entire speech. I do recommend going to C-SPAN to see it all. But we want to address this, and we want to put this in context. In fact, the reason why we're speaking about this 24 hours after the fact is because we reached out to our local sheriff department, we reached out to our local school board to get some more context and real-world application answered for you, our listeners. And we're going to go over what their responses were in just a little bit. But first, before we even get started, we do want to mention that if this is the first time that you are seeing our channel, we want to thank you, and we appreciate that you have been part of our audience. We want you to know that we do long-form political commentary. And every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a live stream with you. We reach out on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, DLive, essentially all of the social media that the internet overlords will allow, to be able to speak with you about these issues and others that are important to you from anywhere in the world, to reach out and to give us your tweets, your chats, your phone calls, to tell us what you think about these issues that affect all of our lives. And so we do hope that you will join us every Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to celebrate the First Amendment, your right to free speech. Because regardless of whether a government agrees or not, whether the internet overlords agree or not, you have an inalienable right to speak, and we want you to celebrate that. We hope to see you this Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So let's get into the issue today. Why it's so troubling, both the memo that was produced on October 4th and its subsequent consequences. And I think that's the part that not many in the news media have been talking about. While they have talked about what was said, they haven't talked about what are the consequences of this. How is this affecting parents? How is this affecting education? How is this affecting the First Amendment in our nation? We believe that these are all very important issues and they need to be addressed. So let's get into that a little bit. Because this issue didn't start in October of 2021. It started far, far earlier than that. In fact, when students went back to school in 2021, many of the schools were doing part-time. Students would either be in schools every other day or portions of the day. And part of that learning, part of their teaching was happening at home online, whether in Zoom or other formats. And that gave the parents an opportunity for the first time, for many of them, to actually hear what teachers and school boards, the curriculum being taught to their children. And many parents were troubled by this. As we found out in many parts of the country, and including New York State and my community here in the southern tier of New York, many parents found out that their children were being taught different variations on critical race theory, an ideology, a very progressive ideology that in its essence states that if you happen to be white, you're an inherent racist and privileged. If you happen to be a minority, you happen to be an inherent victim and that you are less than others. This is a very troubling ideology that many people do not agree with. But yet it is something that is being taught to students. In fact, in March of 2021, in my local community, parents were shocked to hear that teachers were telling students as young as 5 to 8 years of age, they were reading books to them, teaching them not to trust police, and that critical race theory exists. This is inappropriate. And in the subsequent April school board meeting, many parents and many individuals in the community spoke out. To be fair and to be honest, we were one of those individuals that spoke out on April 20th to the school board. And we said at the time, in part, there's something that's being said here over and over again, and I think it's very important to understand it. We're introducing politics to the very youngest and most vulnerable of our children in our community. I think that's wrong. That's not the place of education. That's not the place of the school system. Now, I want to be very clear. I am not blaming the teachers per se. I am not blaming the school system per se. This is a bigger problem. Perhaps the community hasn't been paying attention enough to allow this to seep in. But unlike many people who will be speaking, and they have very personal, serious reasons why they believe in social justice and then why they believe in equity. But let's understand, that's not what the school is there for. The school is there to teach the children, not about equity, a political ideology, not about social justice, a political ideology. And if you do wish to do that, keep that to the high schools, where we have the young adults about to enter into society and going on to higher learning, who can understand and deal with these complicated issues. Instead, what we should be looking at is teaching the fundamentals of these children so that they understand the words, the meanings, the ideas, and the ability to understand and interpret these ideas so that when they are introduced to these political issues, they are able to address those political issues. And we went on to say some more, but in essence, what we want to share with you is that we, like many parents, many individuals in the communities across this nation, were deeply concerned about what was being taught as a curriculum and in materials to students, to young children. Again, some of them as young as 5 to 8 years of age. And so parents spoke out. The more that they learned about what the students and their children were being taught, the more they became upset. And it wasn't limited to just this issue. There are many others that came up as well. And parents were very vocal about their objection. In fact, we saw that across the nation, many parents stood up and spoke out strongly about this, vehemently about this, aggressively about this. And the reaction that they received in return were things like this, as we reported on October 12th, but that many people may have seen from the Daily Kos. In June 23rd of 2021, my school board is under attack, and soon yours might be too. The left-leaning media, the progressive ideology, reacted by insisting parents had no place in the education system, that parents had no voice in what was being taught to their students, and that when parents did react, when they did speak up, sometimes being very boisterous in their comments and their reactions, that those parents were criminals, that they were acting illegally, even when that was not true, which overwhelmingly, massively is not true. And that's not to say that teachers or school boards enjoyed what parents were saying, but that's immaterial. They don't have to like it to understand what someone is saying. This confusion that came out of the progressive ideology that says, well, if I don't like what you say, if I'm offended by what you say or how you say it, well, then it's a crime. That's not law. That's not what the United States believes in. That's not what the First Amendment affords. You don't have to like it, but parents have the right to say it, and to say it forcibly, even aggressively. Not to promote violence, not to promote threats of violence, but they are allowed to say things that are displeasing to members of a school board especially in reference to what their children are being taught or not taught in schools. And this has many implications. But it led ultimately to a conversation between the National School Board Association and the White House. And after a couple of weeks of conversation between those two groups, the National School Board Association and the White House, it led to a letter from the National School Board Association on September 29th. And that letter, as reported, as you can see here, asked the Biden administration to, quote, deal with the growing number of threats of violence and acts of intimidation occurring across the nation without citing any such incidents. As these acts of malice, violence, and threats against public school officials have increased, the classification of these heinous actions could be the equivalent to a form of domestic terrorism and hate crimes, the National School Board Association wrote. They call parents domestic terrorists acting in hate crimes because the National School Board Association and certain progressive elements therein did not like what parents had to say, that parents were objecting to some of this. In fact, we even heard from other individuals who reiterated this very, very clearly one day before the letter from the National School Board Association that was written with help from the White House. We see that there was this message. Virginia gubernatorial candidate Terry McAuliffe stated, quote, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. There's video of this event. The nominee, Terry McAuliffe, made this statement, quote, the parents had a right to veto books, also to take them off shelves. I'm not going to let parents come into schools and actually take books out and make their own decisions. Parents can't make their own decisions about what their children are being taught. Meanwhile, we also have these very same school boards and school curriculums that are removing books like Anne Frank's diary, like Dr. Seuss. They've made a decision for parents on what children will be taught, and they are instead teaching them that they should not trust law enforcement, that if they're born of a certain skin color, that they're a racist, and if they're born of a different skin color, that they're a victim. Terry McAuliffe is supporting that ideology and not the ability of parents to say, that's not appropriate, don't teach that to students. That's not correct for children who are as young as 5 and 8 years old. In fact, we have to question some of the other things that we have seen. How about what we saw just today? Coming out of Kentucky, an investigation underway after Kentucky High School hosts a drag pageant featuring male teens in lingerie giving lap dances to staff. Let me be more precise about this. There was a homecoming event where young underage males, minors, were scantily dressed, and they gave lap dances to grown adults who laughed and cheered and clapped away as this event happened, where young girls were dressed as Hooter girls. And this is completely inappropriate. And where did these students get the idea that this was okay, that this was the appropriate way to act? They got that from their teachers. They were taught that this was appropriate, that this was okay. Those ideas came from their teaching. And so the problem ultimately comes from the teachers. Now, there is an update in this story in Kentucky where there was an investigation on this because it was clearly inappropriate. It was pedophilic activity, and it should be denounced for being that, the hypersexualization of minors. And in that investigation, according to Hazard Independent Schools, the investigation found that appropriate disciplinary action has been taken following the investigation of this incident. As it's a personal matter, we are not allowed to disclose any further information regarding the specifics of the discipline. Wait a minute, this was a public event. This was a public event with teachers and also a mayor that with an elected official that took place with minors. Parents, children were being affected, and we're not sure that parents were actually at this event or knew that this was going to happen or who authorized this. But now they're being denied the ability to know what disciplinary action was taken, if in fact disciplinary action was taken, because we have no way of knowing. It could be as simple as the mayor was told, you shouldn't have done that. It could be as simple as the teachers saying, well, that wasn't the best thing for you to do. Don't do that again. We don't know because the disciplinary action has now been made private on a public event that affected students, minors, at a public school based on the teachings from that school. This is a problem. Parents should be able to speak out about this. Parents should say that this is inappropriate and that they need to be notified of what was done, who was responsible, and how were they held responsible. But we have a notification from the National School Board Association saying that if you do that, you may be labeled a domestic terrorist. That if you speak out about what was taught to these students in Kentucky and other states, that you may be acting in a hate crime, and that the federal government should use its full power against you. And it doesn't end just there, because it's more than just these sexual acts. As we can see, as reported today by the Associated Press, school debate, gifted and talented or racist and elitist. This comes from the Associated Press today. Quote, increasingly, parents and school boards are grappling with difficult questions over equity as they discuss how to accommodate the educational aspirations of advanced learners while nurturing other students so they can equally thrive. It's a quandary that's driving the debate over whether to expand gifted and talented programs or to abolish them entirely. I get the burn it down and tear it down mentality, but what do we replace it with? Asked Marcia Gentry, a professor of education and director of the Gifted Education Research and Resource Institute at Purdue University. So it's about equity. It's about politics in our schools, politics in our education, not just the system, but the actual curriculum being taught to students. And it's resulting in events like this. And even worse, it has resulted in Loudoun County, as has been widely covered and as we covered as well, it resulted in a young minor woman being sexually assaulted. Again, in Loudoun County, what we saw is a sexual predator who has since been convicted of the crime used the identity, the claim of gender fluidity to be in a girl's bathroom and to rape a 14-year-old girl who was in ninth grade. And then when it was found out, that school board, the Loudoun County School Board, covered up the event, transferred that sexual predator to another school where he proceeded to rape another minor child. Parents are very upset about these things, and they should be. But we know that Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a directive, a memo, based on the School Board Association's letter labeling parents as domestic terrorists for complaining about these incidents I have just shown you that are continuing to this day, that parents and communities are upset about. And that resulted in the fact that one of the the acting United States Attorney for the state of Montana issued a directive, and I want to read that for you here, which states in part, the state of Montana has similar criminal laws against threatening and committing acts of violence against members of our educational community. He's introducing a directive that is pursuant to the Attorney General's directive, Attorney General Merrick Garland's directive. So he is adding clarity, and he is interjecting himself into local school boards about threats, about acts of violence, which is fine, but threats. This is to assume that the local communities across our nation, our law enforcement at the local and state level, are incapable of handling the threats at the situations at hand. And they have been. No law enforcement have asked for the federal government to get involved. Just a political faction. And then this same Attorney General out of the state of Montana issued a directive showing 13 different laws. 13 federal statutes that could be used against parents. Things like item 2, interference with federally protected activities. 18 U.S.C. 245. Defendant use force or threat of force. Threat of force. How do you know it's a threat of force? That's subjective. Defendant willfully injured, intimidated, or interfered with a person or attempted to do so. You mean they were intimidated because a parent was very upset, maybe was banging on the table because a school board just covered up the rape of their child? Because a parent might be upset because their male minor children are dressing up in lingerie and giving lap dances to their teachers? Because parents might be upset and banging on a table and shouting because their gifted child is now being denied the ability to learn at the level that they should be? Defendant acted because of a person's race, color, religion, or national origin, which means that's a subjective guess. You don't know that. How do you know that they're upset about this because of someone's race? How do you know they're not just upset because of what was done? The defendant acted because the person was engaged in one or more protected activities as defined by 18 U.S.C. 245. In other words, in the case of Loudoun County, the school board would have used this rule, this directive, to get the FBI to take on Scott Smith. He is the father of the girl in Loudoun County that was raped. And because that sexual predator claimed the gender fluid status, this law would have been used against him. The FBI would have investigated him. Let me give you another example of this. False information and hoaxes. 18 U.S.C. 1038. Defendant intentionally conveyed false or misleading information under circumstances in which such information may reasonably be believed. If someone doesn't agree with you about your belief in critical race theory, if they don't believe with you in terms of gender fluidity or other issues, then they may claim that you have false or misleading information because they don't agree with it. That's a subjective thought. It goes on to say, such information indicated that an activity was taking, or would take place that would constitute a violation of a specified federal statutes involving and point the keyword terrorism. Oh, so you said something that's not true. Perhaps you didn't word as a parent. You didn't word it exactly correctly. Perhaps because you were angry. You didn't word your statement to the school board, your displeasure with their actions, exactly perfectly. Maybe you don't speak in public very often. Maybe you're not an attorney. Maybe your wording wasn't absolutely perfectly correct. And maybe you were very angry at that time. And you've been labeled a domestic terrorist by the National School Board Association. And now, the federal government under the FBI, as interpreted by state attorneys like in Montana, are now going to investigate you. And the trouble with this is the consequence. Again, this is what's not being discussed, the consequence of this. Because imagine, even if you are found innocent, imagine that the FBI steps in and is investigating you for being upset that your young son was just being paraded around his school in lingerie and giving lap dances to teachers. Imagine that you are upset because your child was just raped and the school board covered it up. And now you got investigated by the FBI. And that is being reported by news agencies like the Daily Kos and other progressive news media outlets. You are being investigated, and this could affect your business and or your job and your standing in your social community. Those are changes that are irrevocable. You cannot change that. Once the public has been notified that you have been investigated for potential domestic terrorism, even if you are found innocent, that mark, that besmirchment on your reputation and record lasts forever. The consequences do not go away. And the door has just been opened to allow the FBI to do that. And parents, while they may not be attorneys, understand that very, very clearly. The consequences are important, not just to the First Amendment, but for the ability of parents to feel like they can be involved. Something that individuals like Terry McAuliffe and many Democrats and many progressives disagree with vehemently. This is insane. This is the definition of insanity. And I want you to hear what it is that the United States Attorney General Merrick Garland had to say in reference to this. Now that we've put it in full context, so you understand the weighting of exactly what we're speaking about, understanding the consequences of what he did, and I want to be clear that just so people understand, 17. I want to be very clear. 17 of the attorney generals disagree with what Attorney General Merrick Garland said. 17 of the state attorney generals disagree with him in what he did. This was such a travesty of justice that the National School Board Association itself apologized and removed their letter. They rescinded the letter that they sent out because it was wrong. They were apologizing for calling parents domestic terrorists. And knowing this, and this happened recently, that happened on October 23rd, the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, has insisted that even with this, with the letter being rescinded, taken back, even with the objection of 17 state attorney generals, even with members of the National School Board Association rejecting the letter that they had put out, the outcry of parents, he's going forward. He wants the FBI to be involved in local school board meetings. And many politicians brought up objections. I want you to hear this. You may not have heard this before. You might or you might not have.
Line of the memo specifies harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence. Is it correct under the ordinary canons of construction that a legal reader would understand that harassment and intimidation means something different from threats of violence? Is that correct?
A legal reader would know Virginia versus Black, the Supreme Court definition of intimidation, and a legal reader would know 18 U.S.C. 2261A, the definition of harassment.
And would a parent?
This was not addressed to parents.
But parents read it. You're the Attorney General of the United States. You said you can't think of anything harassing. You directed the G-Men, the FBI, to go after parents.
That's the key. And there you go. Because let me ask you, any of the laws that I have cited, that I have shown you, that what was just stated by the Senator Ted Cruz, do you know what any of those laws are? Unless you're an attorney, unless you deal with politics every day and you've looked this up, which I had to look them up, no, you don't know what they mean. You don't know the definitions. In fact, even other members of law enforcement, the acting United States Attorney General for Montana, had to put in not just the laws, but the definitions of those statutes and their common law naming, not just their title, but what they are stated for. He had to send that out because even teachers and other members of law enforcement don't know what he's talking about. They don't know these laws off the top of their head. How would parents know that? And why wouldn't parents be fearful of this? But the Attorney General's, well, the letter's not for them. It doesn't affect parents, except it directly affects parents. And it has consequences directly to parents and to students and the education system and to our First Amendment. And he should know that. He's been a judge. He's the Attorney General. He knows that his statements have consequences. The White House knows that. The National School Board Association knew that. Let me let you hear something else. This is from Senator Tom Cotton.
Judge, you also told Senator Klobuchar that this memorandum was about meetings and coordination.
Yeah.
Meetings and coordination.
Yeah.
Well, I have in my hand right here that I'll submit to the record a letter from one of your U.S. attorneys to all of the county attorneys, to the Attorney General, to all sheriffs, to the School Board Association of his state, in which he talks about federal investigation and prosecution. It's not about meetings, it's not about coordination, it's about federal investigation and prosecution. Did you direct your U.S. attorneys to issue such a letter?
I did not. I have not seen that letter.
It's got 3 pages. It's got 3 pages of spreadsheet about all the federal crimes that a parent could be charged with, to include the ones you cited.
And there it goes. He doesn't have any idea. He didn't say that. That's not his fault. It's just the consequences of what he did. It's just the consequence of what he has said and how he has implied and directed the federal government to become involved in local issues, in particular between parents and the school boards that they elect and the curriculum that is being taught to the children of those parents. It's just the consequence. It had nothing to do with United States Attorney General Merrick Garland. It's not what he wrote. It's just the consequence of what he wrote. Let me look at something else. Let's look at what we hear from Senator Josh Hawley.
You testified last week before the House that you didn't know anything about this case. I find that extraordinary because the letter that you put so much weight on, the letter that's now been retracted, it cites this case. It cites Mr. Scott's case directly. There's a news article cited in the letter. It's discussed in the letter, but you testified you just couldn't remember it. Maybe this will refresh your memory. Do you think people like Scott Smith, do you think parents who show up to complain about their children being assaulted ought to be treated like this man right here?
Parents who show up to complain about school boards are protected by the First Amendment.
Do you think that they ought to be prosecuted in the different ways that your U.S. attorneys are identifying?
If what they're doing is complaining about what the school board is doing, policies, curriculum, anything else that they want to, as long as they're not committing threats of violence, then they should not be prosecuted, and they can't be.
So again, we see very clearly that United States Attorney General Merrick Garland is saying, well, no, parents shouldn't be treated badly. He's citing the very same Loudoun County school board case that I was just mentioning. Mr. Scott Smith is the father of the daughter that had been raped. And he was arrested at the time. He was removed because he was upset. And the National School Board Association, the Daily Kos, and many other progressive organizations cited his anger at the cover-up of the rape of his daughter and used that to promote the increase in violence and threats. Would you be upset? Would you possibly threaten individuals? Would you, in anger, say things, very vicious things, maybe very aggressive things to someone who covered up the rape of your child, your brother, your sister, your mother, anyone you personally know, one of your loved ones? And yet, based on the directive coming from U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland, at the behest of the White House and the National School Board Association and progressive ideology, he decided to unleash the FBI against parents. That's the consequence of what he was doing. And we want you to understand, even though he says parents have the right to protest, when Scott Smith did that, he became an example to justify the federal government investigating him and other parents. That's the consequence. Let's go back to Ted Cruz for a second. I want you to hear something else.
During your time as a judge, I was a clerk to Chief Justice Rehnquist. I'll tell you what, if I drafted an opinion for the Chief Justice and walked in and it said, there's a disturbing pattern of violence, well, Ted, how do you know that? Well, I got an amicus brief here who claims it. You would fire a law clerk who did that. You're the Attorney General of the United States. This was not a tweet you sent. This is a memo to the Federal Bureau of Investigations saying, go investigate parents as domestic terrorists.
That is not what the memo says at all. It does not.
Is it what the letter says?
That is not what.
Is it what the letter says?
I don't care what the letter says.
You don't care. You said it was the basis of your memo. You testified under oath before the House of Representatives. The letter was the basis of your memo. Now you don't care about the letter?
The letter and public reports of violence and threats of violence. My memo says nothing about domestic terrorism, says nothing about parents committing any such things. My memo is an attempt to get an assessment of whether there is a problem out there that the federal government needs to
The
resolve.
letter on its face says the actions of the parents could be the equivalent to a form of domestic terrorism.
And that is wrong.
And he says, and it's wrong. And yet, even with these protests, my memo didn't say anything. My memo isn't saying any of that. That's not what I'm talking about. No, parents can go ahead and make the comments that they need to make, except we've seen, as I have shown you, that the action is to introduce the FBI into school board meetings, to introduce the full weight and power of the United States government into local school board meetings, even when they aren't wanted. Again, reading from Acting Attorney General Leif Johnson, he says, I write to you in pursuant of the Attorney General's directive. He's doing this, and he sent out these charges and introduced the federal government to local school board politics, interjecting the federal government to attack and be positioned against parents because of what Merrick Garland said, because of what he did. Now, I want to take a moment here. And this is all important information, and I could have told you this in the last 24 hours. I could have said this yesterday. But I wanted to make sure that I was getting this right. Not just because of my personal experience back in April, not just because of the news stories that we've seen from the daily costs in June, the reports that we've seen from Loudoun County with Scott Smith and the rape of his daughter, not just with what we saw senators saying on the Senate hearing floor. I wanted to hear from my local community here in the southern tier of New York. And I reached out to local officials. I reached out to the Broome County Sheriff. And I asked the Sheriff's Department for a statement. And I asked them very specifically, have they received any notification from the New York State Attorney General that states anything similar to what Montana did? Did they get any written directive or any spoken directive that suggested that the FBI should be introduced to school board meetings, that the Sheriff's Department should be introduced to school board meetings, that they should interfere with the ability of parents to be able to speak to school boards? The answer I received on that question, that very specific question, was that the Broome County Sheriff's Department had not received any such directive, whether written or spoken. That is what I received from the Broome County Sheriff's Office, and I needed to get that answer before I came and did this show today. I want to ask further comment about if any member of the school boards had contacted the Broome County Sheriff's Department to say that they had been threatened, that they have received any notifications for requests for law authorities to investigate parents, for those parents speaking out about any issue at a school board meeting. the Broome County Sheriff's Department declined to make any further comment of any part on any question that may be asked by the news media in reference to this. So I don't know. I can only report what they did say. They had no comment on AG Garland's comments. They had no comment about any school board or any activities with school boards. But they did say they didn't receive a letter similar to the letter sent out by the Montana state attorney. Further, we reached out and we made very clear for the Binghamton City School District Board, the local school board, we had reached out to its president, Mr. Brian Whalen, and we sent a letter to Mr. Brian Whalen. That letter is, as you can see here, and we asked Mr. Whalen some very specific questions. In particular, has the Binghamton City School Board received any notification from state or federal law enforcement seeking to investigate parents based on the October 4th memo from Attorney General Merrick Garland? We have not received a response. In fact, we asked 5 questions of the school board, the Binghamton City School Board, and we received 0 responses. We made clear in this letter that we would be taping this episode, this news coverage, this report to parents, and that we gave them more than 24 hours, actually about 27 hours, to be able to respond to us in writing, or if Mr. Whalen preferred, to be able to be interviewed on this program, unedited, verbatim coverage in full context to answer the questions that we have presented here. He refused to respond at all to our requests for comment. He refused to make any comment about this. And that should trouble people. That should make people wonder about this. Because on one end, we have the Attorney General of the United States working in concert with the White House and certain political agencies and operatives to try and advance a political agenda, an agenda whose purpose is to silence parents as parents are interrupting a progressive, the teachings of progressive ideology to students and children. We have no way of understanding that. And this is specifically with the school board that, as we identified back in March, was subject to the very strong response from the public of their own introduction of political rhetoric into the teachings of 5 and 8-year-olds. And they were more than willing to teach the students this critical race theory, but they're not willing to respond to our requests to say, well, now that Merrick Garland is backing you up in teaching the critical race theory, in silencing parents, in denying them the ability to find out what's going on in school boards, and to intimidate them to not come forward with their complaints, what are you doing? We received no answer. I'm not sure how to take that. What is the Binghamton City School Board president afraid of saying? He couldn't even respond by saying we wish to give no comment at this time. I mean, the Broome County Sheriff's Department did in fact say they have no further comment. Why wouldn't the Binghamton City School District not respond in some manner on this critical issue that directly affects parents? And let me ask you, in the same way, do you know what your local school board has said about this? Have you seen what their reaction is to what Merrick Garland has now done? The introduction of the federal government into local school politics, into the teaching of students and the ability of parents to speak about that teaching. Do you know? Is your school board now silent? These are the consequences of what Merrick Garland has done. And if you are upset about that, if you want to know more about that, if you want to investigate that in your local school board, they're silent, and the FBI is now paying attention to you. Whether that was the direct intention by AG Garland or not, and I would say it was, that is the consequence. Maybe you think this isn't a big deal. Maybe you think that this is not as important, that the First Amendment is not as serious, that the actions of school boards are more important, that progressive ideology is absolutely necessary to be taught at the youngest of ages to our students, regardless of whether that agrees with the direction of learning that parents want for their children. Maybe you believe that it is important for the federal government to intrude on your local community activities. Maybe you believe that the federal government is smarter than parents, that they're more involved than parents. That's open. And if you believe that, we ask you to leave it in the comments, to tell us what you think. Or maybe you object to that. We want to hear your voice no matter what. Because we believe it's important for you to speak out on this. We disagree with Attorney General Merrick Garland. We do not believe that the federal government has any place in local schools and education and the actions of parents in regard to their children, especially when those parents want to protect their children from things they believe are objectionable. And of course, you have the right to disagree, and we look forward to hearing those arguments if you have one. We do hope that you have found this to be informative on some level. And if you have found it to be informative, intriguing, if it raises any questions for you, please do like, do share, and most of all, please do subscribe. We would also ask that every Sunday at 2:30 p.m., please join us for our live stream where we speak with you directly, one-on-one, where you're able to call in, leave your texts and chats to speak to us about the issues that affect us all. We appreciate your time that you've given us today, and we hope that you'll be well.